Kia ora, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm a debater from New Zealand. And what I'm going to do in this session is walk you through round 6 of the Australian-British Parliamentary Debating Championship. I think the purpose behind these seminars is to give a view of how we would think about the motion, approach the motion, and some of the strategies we would be using, particularly in the prep session. I have been given this motion roughly at the same time as the teams. And what I have done is I've spent kind of the first 5 minutes as I normally would in a prep session. And for me, what that looks like is breaking down the comparative of the motion and the framework of the motion. And this for me is, I do it exactly the same no matter what position I am. I want to understand the motion from kind of all the different perspectives. And what I'm going to do with you is walk through how I would then take that kind of preparation that I've done and turn it into some useful arguments or useful breakdown of the debate that I can employ no matter which basically side I'm at. But once I have the particular side, with a mind towards delivering for that position in the debate. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is a great initiative, and I'm looking forward to talking about this motion. And the motion is, this House believes that governments should provide disabled people with a direct stipend rather than state-owned disability services. The first thing I'd phrase that when I'm approaching a debate like this, particularly about a debate about like a group of people who I don't identify with, I don't have any deeply personal experience relating to what this group of people have gone through. It's important to be sensitive in the way that you approach the motion. It's particularly important, not just from a competitive perspective, to think about the words that you're using and the way that those words come across to people in the room, and making sure that you do whatever you can to kind of make it a safe place for individuals who come at debating and come to your room from a whole range of different backgrounds. So very important to keep that in motion when you're debating a debate, particular like the one that we're going to be discussing, which I think is an incredibly interesting topic. It's obviously we should be speaking about experiences that are beyond our own experiences, but good to keep a general sensitivity in mind. So the first thing that I do before I even spend much time thinking about the debate, I take one piece of paper. I draw a line down the middle of that piece of paper. You'll see some of my initial thinking of it. Then I fold that paper in half, draw another line, and I'm left with kind of a cross like this. The first thing that I think about is, what is the comparative in the debate? I break down some of the words in the motion that might be ambiguous. I think about really what is changing in this world. And then I think about the framework. What do I think all of the teams, not from the government side or the opposition side, what are all of the teams going to care about in this debate? How might they be thinking about what could be run in this debate? And making sure you have a general appreciation of the topics is very important. So it means you don't get pigeonholed into a particular idea that comes to you early in prep, and you get blindsided by the rest of the debate that focuses on something that, if you'd spent a little bit more time stepping out of that kind of jumping to the arguments, might have appeared to you. Then on the lower half of my piece of paper, I start organizing points, and honestly, it's a little bit similar whether I'm opening or closing at this stage. Obviously, I start writing my speech a lot earlier, say, for instance, if I'm Prime Minister, a lot earlier, and convert this into an actual speech. But I tend to gather my ideas down on, well, really just one side of this paper. The other side is just for miscellaneous thoughts. And then as another note, even though it's not going to happen here, normally I have another pen, because when other people contribute ideas and you want to kind of make that reflected in the way that you're approaching the debate, it's good to highlight that in a different color, just so it makes it a little bit easier for you to track. So let's walk then through how I would approach this particular motion. And the first thing I do is I'd ask myself, okay, are there any words in this motion that I think might be ambiguous? Where might different reasonable people disagree about whether something means? So it's, this House believes that governments, yeah, that all kind of makes sense, should provide disabled people. That's a broad group of people. I'll keep that in mind. Not trying to, you don't want to jump to one particular narrative when the motion is deliberately broad. So this is a very broad group of people with disabilities, and that might be disabilities across a whole range of different areas of their lives. With a direct stipend, that is big words for really just, should we give them money? Rather than state-owned disability services. So interesting that it's state-owned, it's disability services. So that is basically the government's efforts to, across those broad range of different disabilities, cater to people's needs. Nothing in that is particularly ambiguous, I feel, so I can move on fairly cleanly into thinking about, well, what is going to change in this debate? What is the comparative? And if something becomes ambiguous, or I notice something is ambiguous, it'll probably come out in that process as well. So if I think about what is different when I'm giving people money versus when I am just providing them services through a government-owned, government-controlled kind of process, I kind of try and think about it in a chronological sense. I'm telling a story, and what is the story of how these people might interact with those services, and how might that change? So obviously, like, the point of contact might be different. You have someone providing you money from the government versus someone who is within kind of the government apparatus interacting with you in a far more like kind of intimate and personal way when they're actually delivering services to you. So I might be thinking about that point of contact. I'll think about what these people can do with those different the things that are being provided. Like, what are the inherent differences when we're providing someone with cash? That's like something that allows them to participate broadly in the market economy. So that they are providing them services, or I think the opposition would naturally say we're going to be providing these people services, but we're letting them pick their own services and pay for their own services. So it's like a market bottom-up kind of approach versus directly providing services, which is a government top-down approach. So that might be a relevant point of difference. And there's a very different political and social environment that might be operating here with those two options. So the way people perceive the system, either people with disabilities themselves or the broader polity who might be interacting with people with disabilities, or making political decisions about people with disabilities. So really, what is the cost of this policy? How will people be reacting it from a perspective? Those are all things that change with the comparative. I have two different things that might happen. Neither of them is inherently objectionable. They're different ways to try and achieve outcomes. And that's then what I turn to when I'm doing the second stage of kind of my pre-argument thinking. What is the framework of this debate? What does everyone care about? And in most debates, kind of just like about people, I think about what do people need to thrive. And in debates, particularly about people with disabilities or people who are excluded or people who are marginalized generally, often debates kind of break down into two things. One, how do we cater for people's well-being? And this, it's a little bit cheeky because well-being is just a huge topic. And you can cater for people's well-being in a whole broad range of ways. But what I'm really talking about is, do people get the things that they need? Do people get fed? Do people get clothed? Do people get taken care of? When we're talking about people who may face marginalization and isolation, it's important to think about just their general well-being. And then the second thing that often comes up in debates like this is autonomy. So beyond just well-being, beyond just are we providing people with food, are we providing people with shelter, thinking about the human experience and what makes the good life for many people is a sense of autonomy over their own lives, a sense of identity, a sense of meaning, a sense of fulfillment that goes beyond just kind of material well-being. And in any debate where the state is kind of assuming a role of caring for people, or even like think about any debate that is about someone who's in a position of power dealing with people who have less power, you want to really make sure that you're thinking about kind of, okay, are those people looked after? Are those people given a sense of autonomy and meaning? Is there any conflict between these two things? Like, children are an excellent example of a group where we might make a lot of decisions that curtail their autonomy in order to cater to their well-being. Is there any interaction between these two arguments? And this, of course, within a debate about people with disabilities, which is a huge spectrum of different issues facing people, the way you draw the line and how you engage with the interaction of those issues might be very different for different groups of people. So at this stage, I'm thinking, wow, this is a really big debate. It's a really broad debate. Maybe there are some cases very plausibly where we should provide direct services and other cases where we should provide cash. And now I'm starting to think about the debate in maybe a little bit more of a nuanced way. It's forcing me to think about, well, there's so many things that this debate talks about. There's a lot of room in this debate. I need to make sure that I'm not getting fixed on one particular thing. Then the last thing that I'd probably do when I'm thinking about the framework is I think about, okay, this group of people in particular, what gets in the way of their thriving? What are the things that they need really to thrive? So I think about some of the obstacles that I can say that broadly people with disabilities face. So obviously I wouldn't say the most important, but the most kind of plain or obvious is the fact that they have to deal with a disability. And obviously this disability can take many shapes, but I'll be thinking about for someone to thrive, like for instance, if you're someone who has like a sight-based disability, one of the real obstacles to you thriving is you're unable to see. And I'm really interested in making sure that people are able to get treatment that they need if it is something that will help them cope with their disability, or things like access to ADHD medication. Like there's a broad range of treatments that are out there that someone might need to kind of overcome the particular way in which their disability manifests. Then I think about, well, for instance, vulnerability to carers and family. That's often an issue that face people who are disabled. I think about prejudice, and prejudice is, again, a really big word. So you can see in this exercise, I'm kind of like finding the big words and then breaking them to sub things. So under prejudice, I've written individual or systemic. I've written internalized. All kind of, well, within this big word prejudice, how might it break down into different things? I've written down isolation, either isolation that comes from just like loneliness, or it comes from having a particular disability and there's no one in your community who has that type of disability. And how might a government provide for someone who is the only person in, say, in a particular town who needs a particular type of service versus the market. So I think about isolation and whether or not these like how much can services be generalized across individuals. And then I think about like generalization, both negative generalization, that is like not delivering services effectively for people because you take a generalized view of what they need when actually they have very specific versions, versus some of the benefits of generalization, allowing people to make connections with each other, allowing you to deliver things at scale, which means that you might just be able to make more with limited resources and help cater for people's needs in a more intimate way. So what I've just done there is it's not even attached to a particular side or a particular like opening or closing position. It's really just a general, what is changing in this debate? Everyone needs to understand that. And then what is the framework in which teams are going to be operating? What are things that they might care about in general when we care about, for instance, people with disabilities? And now really what I do to then generate actual cases or arguments is look at the interaction between these different things that I've created, and there might be points that come out there. And I think sometimes you're driven a lot by like your framework. So for instance, might be clear, like someone has like 3 interests, and you just structure your case. Here's why we get interest A, here's why we get interest B, here's how we get interest C. This is not a very good motion for that type of approach, because it's the framework, I think, is so generalized, right? Like, because these people have so many different issues that they're facing, because there's so many different obstacles. So in this debate, I'd actually probably let myself be pushed by the comparative. I'm going to explain, here are the things that are different between these two worlds, and then I'm going to tell a story about how that caters to people with disabilities across a broad range of different things that they might face. So in this debate, if I'm on the government side, I might go, okay, so I've come up with a few things on that comparative. One is like the person with disabilities interacting with the state. So on the one hand, they just give you money. On the other hand, they're much more involved in your life. And so I might say, here's why it's important for the government to actually interact with people with disabilities and not just hand them a check. Why it's really important for people who have access to the levers of power to interact with disabled people and their needs in a specific way. And what I might then discuss then in the second point is, well, why does a market not provide for these individuals? And this is where I can take my like thinking about well-being or autonomy. And I can say, for instance, point out that, well, look, a lot of people with disabilities need a lot of support in making decisions. Like there's a big gulf between someone who like someone who has come back from, so say, for instance, we're talking about war veterans, someone who comes back with a physical disability, like they've had an amputation and they have family support around them, and really what they need is specific medical treatment to help them deal with that, versus someone who comes back with PTSD, who might have a lot more trouble making decisions, who might be find it very difficult to maintain relationships within their lives, who might, for instance, struggle with autonomism or addiction, or like the types of subsequent symptoms that come from PTSD. And I might say, look, they might want to say that disabilities are very simple, that we just need to give people money to maximize their autonomy. That vastly simplifies how much support these people need to identify the services that are important to them, to make sure they turn up to those services, and a market economy is poorly targeted to that. And I might break that down into a couple of sub-ideas. What does the market do poorly? It might poorly match people to services. It might get extractive, so it just takes your money and then spits you out if you're low autonomy, so coercive, exploitation, that kind of stuff. What are other stuff that the market might do badly? Oh, sorry, I'm actually prepping for the op in that little bit of thinking. It's poorly matched, might get coercive. It doesn't cater to people who have expensive disabilities. that's probably going to reasonably be modeled out. This debate is interesting because it's and this is thinking that I didn't explain but was kind of guiding my thinking. This debate is about kind of best cases. It's this house believes the government should do something, and there's room for the gov to say, well, this is how they should provide money, and there's room for the op to say, well, this is how we would provide services. This is the best way to provide services. And governments are fallible in predictable ways. So it's not like saying we're going to solve every issue and it's just like perfect utopia versus perfect utopia. There's room here, but I'm not going to get into like a messy like fiat fight. Teams can kind of explain what they're going to do. And I'm not really going to talk about, well, here's why governments will always like kind of muck around the way that they deal with this. Like, I think this debate kind of happens in kind of a clean world. Yeah, so what I've done there is I've come up with lots of ideas about why the market might poorly provide. And then I might talk about, well, okay, there's a political and social environment. How might this look like? Is it going to generate political support for people with disabilities? Is it going to minimize political support? Is it going to make them a lightning rod for aggression or hate crimes or that kind of stuff? So I talk about the think about the political, and what I'll have here at the end of that is kind of like a list of things on my piece of paper. And if I'm a closing team, all I do then is when I'm listening to the prime minister or the leader of the opposition is I'm kind of just like crossing things out. I'm like, okay, so they've taken that point, they've taken that point. Ooh, they've kind of taken this point. I think they've missed this nuance, so I might be thinking about this nuance. What I then end up with probably at the end of that speech is I'm like, okay, here is either like a broad, either they like haven't touched anything and I'm like sick, I can basically run a PM speech, and you're in a very good position as a closing team. Or at that stage you might be like, they've taken like chunks of everything, so I'm going to do inward extensions on a whole bunch of their different points. And what I would encourage people to do is think about like banking the wins that you can take as a closing team. So you don't need to have one big argument that blows everyone else out of the water. It's actually okay to just say, look, I'm going to contribute to the side by adding a lot of crucial kind of pieces to the way that this broader story that the government wants to tell works. And you can spin that into a second. You can spin that into a first if you're doing enough. And often you'll also be able to generate more ideas from rebuttals. So you hear the leader of the opposition speak if you're the op, and you're gonna be like, okay, well, the big thing I can add to this debate is I can kind of flip that material that's coming out at the opening team. So if I were then to do that for the opposition, it actually probably, if I'm closing or opening opposition, it probably actually looks very similar in terms of the types of things that I'm going to discuss. So I'm going to say, well, how might people, if I go to the last point, how might people perceive this? If I'm pro state-owned disability services, I can talk about the way that people who are just given money often get demonized by the media. I can talk about how people will see it as wasteful rather than if we deliver actual services that people need. That's a model of government that people understand and people are able to get behind. If I was, for instance, on the other side, I might be talking about, well, the way that people view state services is they view them as often very useless and inefficient, and not worthy of spending your hard-earned tax dollars on. It might increase the view that that people are with disabilities are not able to be fully participating members of society, can't make their own decisions, and it might bed in certain prejudice that might exist. So on either side, look, it's the same kind of question, but this debate is quite finely balanced. I think it's actually fighting about kind of similar issues on both sides, but does it tilt one way or does it tilt the other way? So, or if I, for instance, look at like the point of contact between people, if I'm on the side that is for government services, I'll talk about, well, you get to interact with them, you get to learn about them. If they're being abused by their family, that's something you're able to pick up. And if you're sending them a check in the mail, you don't even know if like the family is just cashing that check for themselves. And if you're on the other side, you can talk about, like, for instance, abuse in state services, the way that unaccountable government decision makers, when you have someone who's literally highly dependent on you for access to a service rather than a very predictable check that goes out, there's more room for like abusive position in that. And when I'm going through these arguments, I'm often generating like lots of sub-nuances. And again, those nuances are the way in which you deliver kind of that extension at the end, because you look at the list of ideas that you've generated, and because you've gone through the comparative and the framework, you'll developed a very thorough list that covers like a lot of different angles, and that's highly important in a BP debate. And you'll then be able to hopefully dredge something up. So if I were to put a couple of takeaways from this particular motion, this I think is a motion where it's very important to think about what both sides are going to say and to have a really clear vision of what should we as a government be delivering for people with disabilities? Because if you don't have that, it's easy to get pushed off. It's easy to get blindsided. And if you go too broad, for instance, you can always find ways rhetorically and analytically to make it clear that the broad group of people that you're talking about are the level of generalization that's appropriate for this motion. The other thing that I think is interesting about this debate is that you will often be directly clashing with another team. So that's where you should be particularly alive to points that are being run by the opposition. So say, for instance, the leader of the opposition comes out with a really interesting political argument that seems to be smacking opening governments like, here's why markets are better able to deliver services because of, I don't know, like private business efficiency. You can say, okay, sick, I can make this a diagonal debate. It's clear that they're winning on this material. I'm going to provide the counter kind of narrative to that, make this debate diagonal, make it our material versus their material, and hopefully either I go through first, and even if I don't go through first, I've engaged in kind of the most important clash within the debate. I've proved things that are valuable and important counterweight to the very good leader of the opposition and deputy leader of the opposition material, and maybe I'll take the second. I don't think I have anything more particularly to add. I think it's a very interesting motion. I wish all the teams good luck, and I hope people watching this found it instructive.